I was born in Tipperary. I've lived in Cork when I was in college, and I've lived in New York for a number of years, and returned in 2001 to Tipperary. Returned to a family business. It's a printing company that my grandfather started in back in 1911. So we're printing in Tipperary for a long time. My grandfather was Michael FitzPatrick, and kind of in literature he would have been known as Mickey Fitz to everybody, and then Sean FitzPatrick was his older brother, and they had a younger brother then, Packy FitzPatrick, and whereas they would have been out on the run, Packy was the youngest, stayed home and would have been part of, say, the Civil Guard during the Civil War period in Tipperary town, the Republican Guards, say.
And that particular printer was a political edge to it, was there, or side to it?
There was actually, yeah. The newspaper that was printed there was called the Tipperary People, and my grandfather's brother, Sean FitzPatrick, went in there first, working there in 1908, and the proprietor, John McCormack, was actually very instrumental in the nationalist movement at the time. And prior to that, in the New Tipperary campaign, the Planet campaign and New Tipperary, he would have, I suppose, promoted the idea of New Tipperary and that agitation that took place in Tip. So I think that was the precursor to their involvement in the revolutionary period. My grandfather's witness statement has always been there in the house for me to read, and I was lucky enough to live with him for some of my childhood. And a lot of his old comrades would come to the house and talk with him. So being one of the eldest grandchildren, didn't realise at the time what a privilege it was to be just sitting in their company and hearing little bits of information that at the time didn't make an awful lot of sense to me, but as you get older and you get I have a particular interest in history, and in that particular period in time. And again, it's the secondary teachers that I had. The history teacher was Dr. Desmornan, and one of the first days when he heard my name in school, he said, "Well, you know who your people are, and you know their history. You should be telling us about Irish history or the history of Tipperary." And I suppose that piqued my interest, like, why is a teacher saying this to me and making a big fuss about my grandfather and granduncles? So I did go home and then ask that question, and some of the information was slow to come by. You only acquire it over a number of years, and you only process it as an adult, maybe more so. But they were extraordinary. They went into this printing company as apprentices. It's an interesting career. You have to, they must have been quite clever and quite educated, because they were typesetters, which means that you're actually setting type for a newspaper. It's intense work. They went in there at 13 years of age, and it was I think it's 4 or 5 year internship that they had, and in that period of time, they joined the IRB, and then they would have been at the founding of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. They would have been some of the first members, with Sean Tracy and Dan Breen, the Barlows, Paul Merrigan, Ty Crow from Solid Beg. There were so many names that were familiar to me, because these people as old men sat in our living room and or the parlour, which was the home place that we grew up in. I suppose you just absorb it, and they would have been, say, very much part of the headquarters and the organisational officers in the 3rd Brigade. So a lot of their time would actually have been would have been spent, say, with Ernie O'Malley and Sean Tracy, actually typing up, creating circulars, getting dispatches ready, organising people. So they seem to have quite analytical brains, that they organised a lot of that administrative work. So if a dispatch had to be sent out, for all of his life, my grandfather always had used a carbon copy. So that's why I have this material. So he would never send a letter without making a carbon copy of it. So I suppose it was part of the trade that he also would have been able to type. So some of the material would be typed letters, or all of the military bureau statements he would have typed, not just his but other people's, and so there was quite always an archive of material. The other thing is where we live. It's when I was a child, it was over the printing works, and the attic there would have had all the old newspapers, copies of them. They're now in the National Library archives, and in the local studies department, some of them in Thurles. But I actually, as a child, could play amongst those. The attic was just a full stairs up from my room. There was no door to it. So, those kind of things make a difference. It makes it easier to kind of access information. So as I said, he always made a carbon copy or typed the material, so it was there to look back over. And the same with Uncle Sean. He wrote a book in about 1970 on the 3rd Brigade, and they would also both have been quite involved in the pension applications. Uncle Sean was a verifying officer, so they felt very strongly about trying to access pensions for their comrades, and they spent, on a voluntary basis, years of their lives on that. I think the Civil War was an awful thing to be brought on the country, and nobody wanted it. Certainly not my family. I don't believe they wanted it. But the repercussions for my great-grandfather was born just after the famine, and he had one son, and there's a monument up near where he was killed in the Glen of Arlo, and it's just very poignant that it was erected by his father. It just shows that sorrow, that the hurt that he felt, that his name had died out with his son. And that's the thing, all life is precious, and I do feel that when that kind of been excommunicated from the church, when that was put on the Republican soldiers when they were going out to fight, was a huge burden on them that people may not have realised. And equally, you would have had newspapers showing priests blessing the Free State soldiers before they went out to fight, and absolving them of any crimes. So they found that very difficult. Jerry Kiley was my grandmother's only brother. He, as I said, he was killed during the Civil War. He was Dan Breen's aide-de-camp, which was his bodyguard. They were together in McDonough's house in Lisburnan. Paddy McDonough had been killed with Dinny Lacey a couple of weeks previously. They were in the house with his parents, and the Free State soldiers surrounded the house. My granduncle had been with Dan Breen in America during the truce, and when they heard of the fighting in the Four Courts, they came back to Ireland, to Tipperary, and had taken the anti-treaty side. And unfortunately, a Free State soldier was killed in that incident, and within a minute, I presume my granduncle had shot him, and he then was killed. The Thompson machine gun that he had jammed, and trying to get out the front door, he was killed instantly. And I suppose the trauma for the family was felt for a long, long time. As I said, he was the only son. The fact that when he was brought to his family home, that during the week that the Free State soldiers raided the house, that the church wouldn't allow him into the church, and that his father had to bring him on a cart to be buried, caused a lot of trauma in the family. And we still get emotional actually about it. So, yeah.
You can understand why.
Yeah. Yeah. For us, he's the Galtee Mountain Boy. And that song is...
And where were you born and reared?
I was born and reared in a place called Roseborough, between Tipperary and Letton. The house where I was born and where we lived was originally a Dalton home. My grandfather, Tom Hogan, married into Mary Dalton, and sadly both of them died in 1918 of the Great Flu, within a week of each other, and left their children as orphans. So I suppose Hogan and Dalton families were very connected through nationalism. The Daltons were a very old national family in Tipperary town, and the Hogans were from farming people from Ardevillane outside Tip, and very involved in nationalist activities, going right back through kind of support for Parnell and the repeal movement and all that. So I suppose they were kind of kindred spirits, and I suppose that's how they came together.
And what's the connection with the Maloney's?
My great-grandfather, my mother was Maloney, and her grandfather was P.J. Maloney. Now, the Maloney's were from Guttrum. They're from the parish of Salahead, going back to the kind of 1600s. And my immediate great-grandfather, P.J. Maloney, was born in Guttrum in 1869, and one of a family of 13. Families were big that time. And he went to school in Tipperary town, and went on then to train as a pharmacist in Limerick, where he met his wife. His wife was a widow. She had 4 children. She was a Mrs. Hannon. She was originally O'Brien from Nina. And Ellen Hannon married P.J. Maloney and had 4 children. 4 children were May, Jim, Con, who was my grandfather, and I'm called after him, and Pat. After 1916, when he came back to Tip, PJ became very involved in the organisation of Sinn Féin, which had been established in the Rotunda in Dublin, I think in 1913. And Louis Dalton became president of Sinn Féin in Tipperary town, and PJ was secretary. And indeed, my own grandfather, Tom Hogan, who subsequently, as I said, died in 1918, was the vice chairman. So they were all very involved, and I suppose my family involvement couldn't have been deeper from all sides. The National Volunteers split, and he went with the smaller group. The major part of the volunteers supported Redmond and went on to fight in the Great War, many of them. But the group that became known as the Irish Volunteers were very much supporting independence and were prepared to fight for that. And he was involved in the setting up of the volunteers, the Irish volunteers, very actively in Tipperary town, as were his sons.
How old was he at this stage?
Well, there you are. He was older than most of them. Like he was born in 1869, so he was an elder person, way older obviously than all the people who were involved in the formation of the volunteers, like Sean Tracy, Dan Breen, were the Morris Crow. They were the prime movers into Prairie Town. The Maloney brothers, the Barlows, the FitzPatricks. They were all young. They were the kids really when you think of it. Like in 1916, my grandfather mobilised actually, the Galtee Battalion mobilised. A thing that's not generally known. A group mobilised here in Clonmel and they're commemorated. But a group mobilised in Tipperary as well. They were known as the Galtee Battalion at that time. And Con, he was only 19, but obviously he was one of the leaders at the time. So Sean Tracy was very young as well. You know, when you think of it, they really were very young men. Tracy was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary organiser and that. So anyway, after 1916, the work of setting up the volunteers, if you like, moved on apace, and by 1918 there were 6 battalions in Tipperary, and that led to the formation of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, and that happened, I think, in around June or sometime in 1918, in P.J. Maloney's house in Tipperary. And Dick Mulcahy, very interestingly, Dick Mulcahy came down from headquarters to preside over the formation of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. And when you think of it, Dick Mulcahy was very much on the Free State side after. So the friendships were so sad the way they were sundered and all that at that time. So PJ then went back to his pharmacy business and lived until 1949. Stayed very strongly anti-treaty. He was a great friend of Dev Valera's and maintained his friendship with Dev, and died. When he died, Dev was at his funeral. On the other hand, Louis Dalton had married PJ's stepdaughter, Birdie Hannon. You remember Ellen had a family of 4 Hannons before she married PJ, and her daughter, PJ's stepdaughter, Birdie Hannon, married Louis Dalton. So you had the ardent anti-treatyite, PJ, whose stepdaughter was married to Louis Dalton, and Louis actually became a member of the 5th Dáil on the pro-treaty side. So there you have the history and the way the views diverged at the time, sincerely held on all sides. So that was PJ.
And PJ, was there any records of his activities during the Civil War?
Well, they were burned out, and they moved actually to Dublin. They were burned out before the Civil War, during the War of Independence, kind of towards the end of the War of Independence. And very interestingly, moved to Dublin, where they lived in a house given to them by Michael Collins. And my grandfather, Con, his son, was married out of that house in Haddington Road Church in Dublin. So, and right through, I remember my grandmother when she was alive, and she was Barlow now. She was Barlow, but she would never let anyone speak against Michael Collins, even though her son Con her husband Con was the Adjutant General of the Republican forces who opposed Collins. But the friendship, she maintained that friendship. I never forgot that when when PJ was burned out, Collins gave him a house to live in Dublin. And she said, now I don't know when he came back from Dublin to live in Tipperary, but she always said that Collins never looked for the house back from them, even though they had taken totally different paths. So then to go on then with the